CFM Young Professionals are excited to have this web series. We're looking at doing more of these in the future, but this is our first go round. And we picked pollinators during the month of June and Pollinator Week. So we've got this series running through every Wednesday from 6 to 7 through the month of June. And we've got a lot of great topics to hit on. And tonight we're very excited to have Katie Lamke with us from the Xerces Society. She is in charge of running the Nebraska and Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas, and is going to talk with us tonight about bumblebees and a really neat project that we've got going on in the state. So with that, Katie, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. Let me get my screen shared here real quick, and then we can get going. I recognize a few names on here that may have attended the workshop, so this might be a repeat for some of you. How's that look? Good? Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas and the bumblebees that go along with that. And as Jake mentioned, I work for the Xerces Society, which the name kind of throws people off at first, but we get our name from the first butterfly known to go extinct from human causes, which was the Xerces blue butterfly. We've got about 50 different staff in 18 different states that are working in conservation, advocacy, research, education, all for invertebrates and the habitat that they need to survive. So tonight we're going to go over bumblebee diversity, some of the different species that you might find in Missouri and how to identify them. And then I'm going to talk about the Atlas, which is a statewide community science project that's helping to not only track Missouri's bumblebees, but also improve the ways that we can conserve them. So we've taken a pretty extensive workshop that we usually give for the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas participants and kind of scrunched it down into 20 minutes. So we'll see what we can get through tonight. But starting with general bumblebee diversity, this is a map here showing the hotspots, basically, where we find the most different species of bumblebees are in the red zones on the map. So you can see that out in the mountain ranges of Oregon and California and Washington, there's a lot of different species that occupy that same area. And out in Missouri, we have about 10 species. And the bumblebees are really well adapted to that cooler climate. So that's why as you go out towards the mountains and up in higher elevations, you're going to run into more species. And looking at the bumblebee life cycle really kind of helps to understand how they work on the landscape, but it also helps us to identify different species if you know what workers are out on the landscape and when you're looking at a queen versus a worker versus a male, because they can be active at different times of the season. So the image that you're looking at on the screen here takes the whole bumblebee life cycle and lays it out in 1 year's time. So on the left-hand side, we have the transition from winter moving into spring. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing fall move into winter. So if we start in the lower left-hand corner, it's starting the bumblebee life cycle, right? It's the chicken or the egg approach, but here we're going to start with the queen bumblebee emerging in the spring. So bumblebees are an annual species, meaning they're only active on the landscape for one season. So each April, sometimes late March, you'll see bumblebee queens start to emerge from hibernation. So they've been underground, a few inches into the soil or under some leaf litter, kind of just hibernating there, waiting for the soil temperatures to warm up for those first few flowers to start blooming. And once they emerge, they're going to spend a couple of weeks out on the landscape starting to build up their energy, right? They're going to be visiting flowers to collect nectar and pollen. And then they're going to start searching for a nest. And bumblebees like to nest in pre-existing cavities that have some sort of insulation. So a good example would be an old rodent burrow, like an old mouse nest somewhere on the landscape. Bunch grasses are good. Anywhere that's got a messy feeling to it is really keen for bumblebees. So they might be under blackberry brambles, a rock pile, a wood pile, just anywhere that's sort of messy, bumblebees will find a home in. And after they find that nest location, the queen will start building up these wax pots. And inside the wax pot, She puts a nice mixture of nectar and pollen and then lays eggs on those. And then over the next 4 to 6 weeks, those eggs are going to go through metamorphosis, right? So they're going to go from egg to larva to pupa and then finally emerge as an adult bee. And then those adults will take over the foraging. So in the summer is when we see a lot of bees out on flowers, right? Those are a lot of worker bees out foraging. They're collecting nectar and pollen for the colony. They're taking over any sort of defense that needs to happen for the colony. If a predator comes too close, they're maintaining the temperature of the colony. If it gets too hot, the workers can cool it down. If it's too cool, they can warm it up. And then the queen's job really becomes just laying eggs and tending to those developing eggs. So during the season of the summertime, right, when we see a lot of the blooms out, that's mostly when we're going to be encountering bumblebees, when they're out foraging and collecting food. And then towards the end of summer is when male bees are produced and new queens. So male bees and new queens are produced around the same time, and they leave the nest and they mate outside of the nest. And after mating happens, the male bees will die off. The worker bees that have been in the colony all summer will slowly die off. And that original foundress queen will also die off. So then the only bumblebee that's left on that landscape is the newly mated queen. And she spends a couple of weeks out foraging to build up her energy reserves because she's got to survive the whole winter, right? So whatever is flowering out on the landscape in late summer, early fall are really key resources for those bumblebee queens. So after she's got those food resources, she's going to go find somewhere underground. And this is a part of the life cycle that we really don't know a whole lot about because it's very, very hard to find a single bumblebee queen who's under the ground. But we think that it's usually a few inches under the soil. Sometimes it's associated with pine needles, leaf litter. And after she survives the winter, she will emerge in spring and start this whole life cycle over again. And then moving into ID, if anyone has spent time identifying plants or birds or some sort of snake, maybe, it takes some time to learn the identification process because each organism seems to have its own set of characteristics that we have to look for. And in bees, it's the color patterns that their hairs are. So bumblebees are very, very hairy creatures, and they have different colors of hairs in different parts of their body. So the way that we tell these species apart can largely be done by color patterns. So the first part we look at is their head. We look at the colors on the front of their face and the top of the head. And then we look at the thorax to see what color it is. Most times it's going to be yellow or black. Sometimes there's going to be a pattern that we look for. So is there a circle on this bee's thorax? Is there a stripe on the thorax? And then we look at the abdomen. And the abdomen is split into 6 different sections that we call tergites. So at the top there, the yellow segment is called tergite 1 or T1. All the way down to the bottom is tergite 6 or T6. So each of these segments can be a different color. And depending on the pattern of those colors, it helps us figure out the species. Something to be aware of though, is that there can be variation within species. So between queens and males and workers of the same species, you can see different color patterns. Sometimes even between workers of the same species, you can see different color patterns. But once you figure out the general pattern, excuse my cat, it becomes easier over time. So one of the first common species that you can see in Missouri is the brown-belted bumblebee, or Bombus griseocollis. This is a very common and abundant bee throughout most of its range. And the key feature for this one is that on T2, or that second abdominal segment, it has a brown or yellow crescent shape on it. So instead of that color pattern going all the way across the abdomen, it's got a nice crescent moon shape of color, and it's usually brown. The other thing about this species is that it is very well groomed. So this species has very short and even hairs on it, whereas some of our other bees have long hairs and it makes them look a little bit scraggly, but this one looks like it's got a fresh buzz cut. Next is the two-spotted bumblebee, or Bombus bimaculatus. And this is one of the first bumblebee species to emerge in our area. So some of the first queens, and I've actually been seeing workers of these bees out now because they've had that 4 to 6 week period. The characteristic for this one is that on the second abdominal segment, it's got a nice W shape. Sometimes it's a really large W shape of yellow, like in this photo here, but sometimes it can be really tiny. Then we've got the American bumblebee, or Bombus pensylvanicus. And this is a species of conservation concern, meaning that in enough states, there's been population decline detected. And when you look broadly at its range, you can see that its range is declining. So there's enough evidence behind the species that we know that it's in need of conservation. And a good way to tell this bee is that on the first abdominal segment, it's half black and half yellow, which it sounds a little bit tricky to imagine yourself looking that closely at a bumblebee, but I promise when you take photos or you have them chilled on ice in front of you, it is something that you can train your eyes to see relatively quickly. And then we have the Southern Plains bumblebee. This is another species of conservation concern. And it's got yellow on the first 2 abdominal segments and a nice black stripe in between the wings. And the hairs on these ones are interesting in that they look like somebody has taken a comb and some gel and just sort of greased those hairs back. They lay really, really flat on the abdomen. And again, it's a characteristic that when you have it in front of you, you will notice it. And it just looks different, but it's something that helps you remember, oh, this is the Southern Plains bumblebee. It's got that greased hairs to it. And the last one I want to cover is the yellow bumblebee, or Bombus fervidus. And as its name alludes to, it is a very yellow bumblebee. It's got some black hairs on its face, a thin black stripe between the wings. But other than that, this bee is majority covered in yellow hairs. And the interesting thing about this species is there's only been a handful of observations from Missouri. However, when habitat models are ran, right, and we're trying to figure out places where this bee should reside based on habitat, Missouri always pops up as a location for this bee, yet it's not observed very often. And so it could be a matter of that there's not enough eyes out looking for this species. And last August and September during the Atlas, when people were out surveying, we had 2 observations come in that looked like it could have been this species, but the photo angle wasn't good enough for us to verify it. So we're really excited to see if people come through this summer and actually find some females of this species, because that would be really, really unique record for the state. So now we're going to shift gears away from the species in Missouri and talk about the Atlas project itself. And the project is a collaborative effort to track and conserve Missouri's native bumblebees. And it's a partnership between the Missouri Department of Conservation, Mizzou's College of Ag, Food, and Natural Resources, as well as Pheasants and Quail Forever and the Xerces Society. So there's a whole big group of us working together to help the bumblebees. And it functions off of community science. So the everyday Missourian can get involved in helping bumblebees, right? So when you sign up for the Atlas, you're asked to go out and conduct surveys in whatever part of the state you want to, and you report that information back. And what that information gives us is a really nice data set that we can use to monitor the species, the populations, their distributions, and we can compare those to 50 years ago, right, and see how things have changed. Are certain species declining in the state? Are certain species moving west in the state? Are certain species more abundant? You know, we can really get a feel for how the populations are doing. And it helps to fill in knowledge gaps regarding habitat associations. So not only are you running a bumblebee survey, but you fill out this form that basically provides a quick snapshot of the habitat that you're in. So you tell us what plants are flowering, what plants the bees are using versus what they're not using. You list any features that we might associate with nesting resources. And this information allows us to create evidence-based recommendations, right? So we are doing a lot already to conserve pollinators, but if we know which plants they prefer in the springtime, we can incorporate that into restorations. Just like if we know if they're preferring a certain habitat type over one another, we can prioritize what parts of the state we're committing to pollinator conservation. So to get involved with the Atlas, you start by going to mobumblebeeatlas.org and you adopt a grid cell. And this is the current grid map as of yesterday. So I think this one is up to date. And anywhere here that's green or yellow is a grid cell that's still up for adoption, meaning you select one of these cells and you're saying, I'm going to survey for bees in this part of the state. And it can be in your hometown, it can be somewhere where you might visit family, it can be somewhere where you might go camping, or maybe you're driving to a neighboring state and you're going to go right through this grid cell. The option is up to you wherever you want to survey. And then we ask that you just conduct 2 surveys in between June and September. So there's a lot of flexibility to get that done. And after you've adopted the grid cell, we're not just sending you out blindly into the prairie or the woodland, wherever you're going to go. We do have a really nice training protocol. Our workshops actually just finished up about 2 weeks ago, but they were recorded and they're online for viewing right now. We also have a PDF version, so if you're more of a reader and you want to just look through the text, that's also on there. And on the website, we've also got the identification guides, the data sheets, everything that we've developed for the project to help you find success when you're conducting surveys is on the website. And then comes the fun part, is actually going out and looking for bumblebees and swinging the net, and everything about the Atlas is catch and release. So no bumblebees are harmed in this. And the way that we get around that is by chilling bees. So when you catch one, you put it into a little vial, stick that vial in ice, and it essentially sends the bumblebee into like a hibernation mode, right? So they're chilled out, they're not moving, and then that allows us to take really high quality photographs and submit them. So then on the other end, myself and other team members behind the Atlas can go in and look at the photos that you've taken and say, oh yeah, that's this species. And the way that we submit data is through Bumble Bee Watch. And if you're familiar with iNaturalist, Bumble Bee Watch is a similar platform, but it's just for bumblebee observations in the United States and Canada. And so it launched in 2014, and since then, over 30,000 people have submitted bumblebee observations. And we're up to almost 80,000, so it's quite a good sized database, and it feeds directly into this larger sort of mothership database of bumblebees called Bumblebees of North America. And this is the database that is like the know-it-all. When you want to know something about a bumblebee or where it resides, how long it's been there, this is what you would go to. And so the data that we're collecting feeds directly into that. And what's really impressive is looking at the effect that community science has had. So in almost the last decade, about 25% of all the records that are in that mothership database have come from Bumblebee Watch. So that's just everyday people taking a photo of a bumblebee somewhere, like while they're on a hike or while they're just sitting in their backyard and submitting that. So 25% of what we know about bumblebees today has come from community science, and that's just amazing to me. And the other cool thing is that we now have this mobile app for it. So just like iNaturalist, you can download it to your phone, snap pictures, and upload them right away, and it goes into this data set. And to sort of show Bumblebee Watch in a different way, I've isolated observations from the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas and from the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas through time to just see how the progress has happened through the years, right? So 2014 to 2018, there were about 300 observations for both states. And in 2019, when we launched the Nebraska Atlas, we immediately added about 700 observations. And then last year, when we had Nebraska going and Missouri was launched, it went up to 2,700 observations. And you can see that those states on the map there really start to fill out as more people just become aware of this. And so this season, it actually just started on June 1st, people are out surveying for bumblebees now. We're really, really excited to see what's going to come in and how many observations we're going to get. And just some of the highlights to go over. This one I'm pulling from the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas because we don't have that much data from Missouri yet because it just launched last August, so it's relatively new. But from Nebraska, and this is something that could happen in Missouri too, volunteers observed the Southern Plains bumblebee, which is an at-risk species, in 13 new counties where it had never been seen before. And that's not to say that it hasn't existed there before, but it's that idea that with more people out looking for bumblebees, we learn exponentially more than we would if it was just, say, myself out looking for bees. And we also get to look at plant associations. So from the habitat data that comes in here, we have, I think it's the top 12 plants that were most visited by bumblebees in Nebraska. And so you can see sunflowers are on there, spider flower, native thistles, prairie clover. But not only can we look at most visits to plants, we can also look at which plants attracted the most species of bumblebees, right? So if we're trying to provide forage for a wide variety of pollinator species, sometimes it helps to look at this. So you can see that sunflower there, the bar on the far left, it did have the most visits, but it didn't provide forage for the most number of different species, right? The first one there would be native thistle on the third bar, and then prairie clover. So those are things that we have to take into account when we're designing seed mixes, is what pollinators are we providing forage for? How many are going to be able to use this plant? And not only are we finding out about the bees and the plants, but the people that are participating in this project are finding a lot of value in it. It's becoming a very purposeful activity for people and they're enjoying their time, right? So after the seasons, we send out an evaluation and say, you know, how was your time? What did you learn? Could we improve it? And it comes back positive each year. And the exciting thing is that people want to keep coming back. So when we ask them if they plan to return for another season, majority of them say yes. And we have social media pages on Facebook and Instagram to just keep up with people, because you never know what you're going to come across when you're out doing a bumblebee survey. You know, it might be that you found a really cool species for the first time, or maybe you just found a really cool nature park in a new part of the state that you've never been before. So keeping up with all the volunteers is definitely a benefit to community science. You know, it connects us to a lot of different people that we might not have encountered before. So if you want to get involved with the Atlas, you can log on to mobumblebeeatlas.org. And on there, we have the workshop recordings, we have the handbook, we've got the grid cell adoption form up there, the identification sheet, and the survey season is officially open as of yesterday. So yeah, that's all I've got for tonight, and I'd be happy to take anyone's questions.
Thanks, Katie. That was a great presentation.